Intentional Torts Study Outline Audio. An intentional tort is a volitional act done for the purpose of causing or having knowledge of reasonable certainty that it will cause the result that produced the injury. You must show the defendant's act was a volitional act. The defendant intended the act because the act was voluntary. The defendant intended the resulting harm to the plaintiff, either because the result was desired or expected. Specific intent means that the defendant acts with the desire to cause harm. General intent, the defendant is substantially certain that the result will occur. Transferred intent. When a person commits an intentional tort towards anybody, that person becomes liable to injury to any and all other persons. Intentional torts. A, B, C fit. Assault. Assault is a volitional, intentional act creating reasonable apprehension in the plaintiff of immediate harm or offensive contact. You must show the defendant's act was voluntary, not a spasm, a reaction, or the act of another. You must also show the defendant's desire to cause apprehension or substantially certain that the act will result in it. You must show that the defendant's act actually caused the plaintiff's apprehension of imminent harmful and offensive contact. The plaintiff actually perceived and suffered apprehension and can be in terms of their dignity suffered. Immediacy, perception based on the plaintiff of reasonable sensitivities unless phobia targeted. Note, apprehension is enough. Fear of concern does not apply. Note, conditional demands and mere words are not enough. Must be a physical gesture. Battery. Battery is a volitional, intentional act which causes harmful and offensive contact to the plaintiff's person. You must show the defendant's act was voluntary. The defendant desired to cause contact or was substantially certain that the act would result in it. You must show that the defendant's act caused the harmful or offensive contact. You must also show that the contact actually caused the harm, damage, or offense under the reasonably prudent person standard. This is the objective standard. Note, the defendant does not have to be present. Note, contemporaneous knowledge of touching is not required. Conversion. Conversion is a volitional, intentional act resulting in a substantial deprivation of the plaintiff's chattel. You must show intent on the part of the defendant to bring about the interference. You must show an act by the defendant that interferes with the plaintiff's right to possession. Interference warrants requiring the defendant to pay full value to the plaintiff for loss. Note, courts look at inconvenience to the plaintiff as result of the defendant's interference. Note, courts look at the duration that the defendant controlled or had dominion over the chattel. Replacement value is full replacement cost or fair market value. Reasonable mistake by the defendant about the ownership is not a defense. False imprisonment. False imprisonment is a volitional, intentional act or omission on the part of the defendant that constrains or restrains the plaintiff to a bounded area with a knowledge of the confinement and no reasonable means of escape. You must show that the defendant's act was voluntary. Note, volitional acts are when the defendant physically binds the plaintiff or when the defendant restrains the plaintiff with threats. Note, volitional omission is purposely failing to free the plaintiff or provide egress means. You must also show that the defendant desired to cause confinement or substantially certain that the act would result in it. You must show that the defendant intended to confine or restrain and actually confined or restrained the plaintiff. You must be able to identify the bound area. Note, the victim or plaintiff must be aware of the confinement unless injured. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. This is a volitional, intentional act amounting to extreme or outrageous conduct which causes severe emotional distress. You must be able to show the defendant's desire to cause mental distress was substantially certain that the act would result in it. You must also show that conduct must be extreme and outrageous and must be intentional or reckless. Conduct must also actually cause emotional distress. There must be a causal connection. Emotional distress must be severe but does not have to manifest physical symptoms. Liability applies due to distress over close relatives, even if no physical harm to the plaintiff. Liability applies if physical harm results in the plaintiff due to distress, includes close friends. How to judge extreme and outrageous conduct. Conduct in public rather than private, continuous and repetitive, lower standard for common carrier, innkeeper, or if fragile class of person, including children, the elderly, pregnant, and the hypersensitive. Trespass to land. A volitional, intentional physical invasion onto, over, or under the land of another. One is liable for all damages caused to the land or nominal damages. You must show that the defendant or object intentionally entered and remained without permission and exceeded the scope thereof. Invasion must actually occur. Air or subterranean invasions count. Act resulting in invasion was volitional and intentional, but not necessarily with intention to invade, because mistake is not a defense for the defendant. Damage to property need not occur, but may only result in nominal damages. Trespass to chattels. A volitional, intentional act causing substantial interference or damage to chattel interests of another. Damage or cost of replacement determines remedy. Must show the defendant intended to bring about the interference. Interference with chattel actually occurred and must prove actual damages to it. Defenses to intentional torts. Darn cops. Discipline. A person with recognized authority is privileged to act reasonably given the circumstances, primarily used for battery and false imprisonment. Authority of law. A person is privileged to act reasonable to prevent a crime from being committed in their presence. Police may arrest for acts based on reasonable suspicion. Recapture of chattel or fresh pursuit. A person is privileged to act reasonably with reasonable force to recapture their own chattel if they have asked for and been refused the chattel, and they are in fresh pursuit of the wrongly taken chattel, or they lose possession of the chattel through no fault of their own. Necessity. A person is privileged to act as reasonably as necessary to protect the safety of self, others, and or property. Acts done to protect others or their property is public necessity and is absolutely privileged. Acts done to protect the self or own property is private necessity and is qualified privileged. Consent. Fully informed consent from a person with legal capacity is a complete defense, except to a battery which would result in great bodily harm. Others. Defense of others. A person is privileged to act reasonably as necessary to defend others who are not aggressors from harm. Property. Defense of property. A person is privileged to act reasonably with reasonable force to protect their property or the property of others. Deadly force is never permitted. Verbal warning is required. Self-defense. A person is privileged to act reasonable with reasonable force to protect the self with no duty to retreat. Deadly force may be permissible. Infancy, insanity, and incompetence are no defense to intentional torts. Affirmative defenses based on privilege. Consent. To one who was willing, no harm is done. Express consent. The plaintiff consents to interference with person or property except under duress or fraud. Implied consent. The plaintiff externally observable conduct based on custom or circumstances. Consent is based upon an objective standard. Consent to an unreasonable demand cannot be construed by silence. Person with invalid capacity can't provide consent. This includes infants, mentally ill, intoxicated. Consent has a scope. If the defendant exceeds the scope of consent, then the defendant loses the benefit of the consent. Self-defense, defense of others. A person is entitled to use reasonable and proportional force to prevent any threatened imminent harmful or offensive bodily contact or any threatened imminent confinement or imprisonment. Timing must be immediate, cannot act at a later time. Is deemed out of retaliation. Defensive act must be based on reasonable perception of the immediacy. You may use such force as is reasonably necessary to protect from injury or harm, not more. Verbal provocation, taunting, or insults is not enough, must be a threat or a gesture. Some jurisdictions require a duty to retreat, but never a retreat from the castle or your home. Defense of property. In general, a person may use reasonable force to defend their property, land, or chattels. You may never use deadly force only to protect property. Must be protecting yourself. Cannot use mechanical devices unless privileged to use similar force if present. Owner must make a verbal demand that the intruder stop and allow time to obey but not if imminent violence or harm will result. If it appears that a request would be useless. The effect of a reasonable mistake varies by jurisdiction and situation. Recapture of chattels. The property owner has the general right to use reasonable force to regain possession of chattels wrongfully taken if it is done in fresh pursuit or hot pursuit. Shopkeeper's privilege to detain for reasonable investigation and recovery if reasonably believes that chattel has been taken unlawfully. Necessity, privilege to invade or harm the plaintiff's property to prevent immediate and great harm to others, which is the public necessity, or to self or property, which is private necessity. The owner must allow access until the threat passes. This will negate trespass, but not damages suffered. Law enforcement privilege to arrest or use reasonable deadly force. Arrest requires warrant except for felony, breach of peace, or crime committed in the presence of a police officer. But police may not use more force than necessary, reasonably necessary, unless lives are threatened. Injury to the defendant. This can be used as a defense to protect litigation rights or personal property. Defendants may use reasonable force as necessary to detain a plaintiff for a reasonable period of time to investigate events that has caused them damages. Note, emotional damages can be the basis of general damages for any intentional tort. This ends the intentional tort audio outline.